Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're joined with someone who's going to be talking with us about something that we should be aware of that's probably happening right underneath our noses. A simple word, it's an Arabic word which is known as Hijra. Hijra is taught as a duty in Islamic doctrine as another path to achieve the same goal as what is known as jihad. It's to spread Islam worldwide and subdue the unbelievers. Hijra is colonization. It is jihad without the armed struggle. On the Beyond 50 radio program today, we're going to be talking with Ann Corcoran, who's going to be telling us how this started in her hometown and why we should be alarmed as it's really happening from forces and people within our back door. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Ann Corcoran. Ann, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Yes, thank you, Daniel. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, how did all this start for you? What caught your eye that got you involved in this?
Well, back in 2007, first off, I should mention I live in a rural farming county in western Maryland, a conservative county, a traditionally red county, and our county seat is Hagerstown, Maryland. And back in 2007, I just noticed, and some of my friends noticed, that a couple of hundred refugees had been dropped off, and I will say dropped off, because our first concern when we heard about this was that the refugees weren't being properly cared for by the Virginia Council of Churches. Now, again, I live in Maryland, so we wanted to know how it was that the Virginia Council of Churches was bringing impoverished people. About 100 of them were Meskhetian Turks, which are Muslims from Russia. They speak Russian, and originally Turkish people, and neither Russia nor Turkey wanted them. So we took thousands of them into the United States, by the way. And so I just simply wanted to know at the time, what was the governmental process that allowed this to happen? Who said the Virginia Council of Churches could bring refugees to Maryland? So one thing led to another, and I have now spent the last 8 years, almost every day, researching and writing about this program because it just captured my interest so greatly that how could this be going on for 35 years in the United States and people didn't know about it. So that's in a nutshell how I got involved.
Now, what's alarming about what you're seeing happening here?
Well, I think on the superficial level of good government, what's alarming is the fact that it is done very quietly, has been for years. Local communities are virtually kept in the dark. If it weren't for me and a couple other people who happened to notice and start asking questions, the program would be well established here in my county now. It does not exist, by the way, because we raised some red flags about how it was being run. But on the superficial level, that's the big problem. Is this, what sort of a governmental process is this that allows this to be happening from the federal level and dumped on communities who are suspecting? Then there's the big question of numbers. How many can each community afford to manage? And then there's another big question is, where are these refugees coming from? And many of them are coming from countries which frankly hate us. Mm-hmm. So there are a lot of different things you can hook your hat on here that are problematic.
Now, this term Hijra that I brought up earlier, tell us a little bit more about that and what that means there.
Yeah, sure. Like other Americans before, I've been reading a lot of stuff about Islam, and one of the things that caught my eye was a book called The Trojan Horse, the Islamic Doctrine of Immigration, Hijra, the Islamic Doctrine of Immigration. And it fit, I was just blown away by the fact that it fits so well what I was seeing here and in Europe. I do write a lot about what's going on in Europe, and Muhammad told his followers that it was their duty to migrate, to spread Islam, to create a caliphate across the world. And migration is an important duty that that Muslims are rewarded for, presumably, when they get to the afterlife, because they have migrated to spread the religion. And it can be migration from like one town to another town. That counts. It's not even just from country to country.
Now, that's pretty interesting. So we're allowing or bringing in groups of Muslims to America. Basically, it's through our own government. So what kind of process do they go through that allows these people to, I guess, just become U.S. citizens?
Yes, they do. I want to emphasize right up front, this is legal immigration. So whenever people say, you hear it all the time, oh, I'm okay with legal immigration, it's illegal I have a problem with. Well, they don't know what they're talking about, frankly, because our legal immigration system is in complete disarray, and I think is not a system that is helpful to preserving American culture going forward. What happens briefly is that the United Nations is picking most of our refugees. This is as a result of the Refugee Act of 1980. Let me say, prior to that, some of your listeners may remember the period where we brought in a lot of Vietnamese refugees, before 1980, and they were pretty much taken care of by individual churches. They were literally, families were taken under the wing of a local church, and the church took care of them and helped them through the process of becoming an American citizen and took care of them, basically. The system set up in 1980 has placed 9 major federal contractors in charge of deciding what refugees go where. The UN picks them, the State Department brings them in, Department of Homeland Security is supposed to have screened them in advance. But how do you do that when you're coming from a failed state? And I will suggest there was no way they could properly screen the tens of thousands of Somalis we brought into the country already, nor is there any way they're going to properly screen the tens of thousands of Syrians that are already headed our way. As I said, these contractors then, these 9 major contractors, some of which may sound like church groups to people, but are really not. They're not passing the plate in church for this program. They divvy them up between 190 cities, plus more than 190 cities in the United States, and they have contractors working in each of these cities. There are 350 or so subcontractors working under the 9 big contractors. So it's quite a setup, and they are paid, the contractors are paid by the head to resettle refugees in your towns, and thus there is no incentive to ever slow the flow, because if they slow the flow, they have to let off staff, they have to close offices. So it's just one big perpetual generating money machine for these contractors.
Geez, you didn't think we learned our lesson too well when Fidel Castro expunged his 100,000 Cubans, into the United States, and now we seem to be systematically doing the same thing with, as you were saying, people that tend to not really have a good eye toward America.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's just mind-blowing. When you think about it, people don't realize this. We have brought well over 100,000 Syrians. I mean, not Syrians yet. 100,000 Somalis into the United States. They've been distributed all over the country. Most have ended up in places like Seattle, Washington, or Minneapolis, Minnesota, or San Diego, or Columbus, Ohio. But we've also brought in well over 100,000 Iraqis just since 2008, and about 65% of the Iraqis we've brought in are Muslim Iraqis, almost equally split between Sunnis and Shias, so that, in fact, what are we doing, importing their civil war to America by bringing half Iraqi Sunnis and half Iraqi Shiites here? It's just insanity.
Mm-hmm. Now, what are some of the areas that these Muslims like to settle in America? What are the reasons they pick these particular areas?
Well, actually, the Muslims aren't picking them. They're being picked by these 9 big contractors. And the 9 contractors, let me tell your listeners, assuming we have time to run down this whole list, are the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is the biggest contractor. They're paid $70 million a year to run this program throughout the United States. Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Episcopal Migration Ministries, World Relief, which is the evangelicals, Church World Service, which includes some of the mainline Protestant churches, Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, and then there are 3 secular ones, the International Rescue Committee, the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, the Ethiopian Community Development Council. I don't expect your listeners to remember all of those. The thing they do need to remember is that they sit down every week, the key players in those organizations with the State Department, and they decide if your town is going to get XYZ refugee. It depends on all sorts of things. It depends, for example, if there's mosques in your community, you're more likely to get Muslim refugees than if there are not mosques in your community. We do bring some Christian refugees. I don't want to imply that this whole program is just a Muslim pipeline, but we do bring some Christians, we bring some Hindus, and so on and so forth. So they're deciding, and the factors include, for example, one of the other factors included is whether your state expanded Medicaid under Obamacare. You're more likely to be a targeted state because there's going to be health care then for the refugees, and they all need health care. It's a really bogus argument that they're going to get a lot of good employment that's going to pay them health care. But we'll be paying for the health care as well as the school system and so on and so forth. If they've run into a little bit of a backlash in a community, they may start to back off a little bit and not bring some for a little while, just till the backlash calms down a bit. But once your community has been targeted, and again, Hagerstown is one of the few where the program was stopped, once your community starts getting refugees, more will be coming because they bring the relatives of the first group, and they're paid by the head to resettle the relatives of the first ones they brought.
Now, Ann, how has this affected where you live? Give us an idea of the experiences that are going on there that probably are giving people a sense of unnervedness, I guess.
Yeah, well, where I live, the program was stopped. And it was stopped. Here's what happened, and why we're one of the few places in the country where once it got rolling, it was rolled back. And what happened was myself and several citizens here wanted to have a public meeting. We wanted all the key players to come to the community, hold the public forum, and explain how all this was going to work. And questions we had were, well, what if our city gets overloaded and we can't afford this? Can we stop the flow? Things of that nature. Those are the kind of questions we asked. We had a big public meeting. It got contentious. And about 10 days later, the U.S. State Department closed it down here. That's one of the few times I've ever seen in the country where one was closed down. I don't know the full background of why that is happening. But the places that are problematic that I'm hearing from all the time, and I've traveled now some this year to various places. I traveled to Minnesota, which is really overloaded with Somali refugees. There are all sorts of problems. One of the first things communities feel is the impact on the school system. It's very, very expensive to educate a refugee who's coming into the country with very little schooling. Usually they have to be segregated from the regular stream in the school because they're not up to speed with American students. And the language expenses in school systems is the first big impact people see because they have to hire more teachers who are trained as in English language teaching, and other problems associated with that, with additional students in the school. Manchester, New Hampshire, which is an overloaded city, has 82 languages in its high school. So you can imagine trying to teach children who speak 82 languages.
82 languages.
In Manchester, New Hampshire, I spoke directly to the mayor, and he told me that himself. And they're not alone. Manchester, New Hampshire is not alone. There are other cities, too. Wichita, Kansas, I can't remember the number, something like 60 languages in the school system.
Wow.
It's extremely costly. You probably got a lot in your school system, too, but I've never looked it up.
Now, it's interesting because I had been shown by the producer a couple of different videos that, of course, are posted on YouTube about what's been happening in Europe with the same situation here, and it seems to be pretty extreme where they have what are known as no-go zones, apparently an area where emergency services, police force, things like that just won't go into these neighborhoods. They're sort of closed off. And there was one particular person in England who was talking about how a lot of their culture seems to be fading away as a result of this. So it just seems like they're just kind of taking over, and you get the feeling that they're going to impose and, quite frankly, demand their rights, their laws over whatever may be existing in the areas that they tend to go and be in.
Yes. Yeah. What's going on in Europe? I write about Europe all the time because I think it is a harbinger of what is to come here. I mean, it's just gotten horrible in the last month.
Now, if I may, too, it's interesting because just a couple of weeks ago, as I was sort of being shown this, I thought, well, this might be something interesting to talk about here, is that I actually talked with a woman who came over. She's from England. And she must have been probably in her mid to late 60s, so, you know, this is somebody who's lived there pretty much all of her life. And I said, can you tell me about this? And this was her response to it was, people in America seem to have a different view about what's really going on in the rest of the world. She says, it's not really what you think it is, that actually we're kind of embracing that because they don't seem to have younger generations coming up and replacing them, so to speak. So they're welcoming, into their country, people who are ambitious and things like that. So basically, in essence, she was saying this wasn't a bad thing. And I thought, okay, well, maybe we are seeing something different here, but maybe give us some clarity on that.
Yes, well, I do feel for Europe, for most European countries. I did a post the other day on the demographics. Frankly, they are not producing enough children to replace themselves. They simply are not. And they are therefore, especially in places like Germany, welcoming this migrant flow into the country. But what they're not considering, I don't think, is that Islamic migrants are not like European migrants or even Asian migrants who want to just work hard, get ahead, and blend into the country which they have settled. It's a totally different thing. Islam, in my view, is there to take over. And I think anybody who doesn't see that is being extremely naive. So the question is, okay, so do you bring in tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands into Europe right now, people from cultures that are never going to fit in because you think you're not going to have enough workers to pay, into pension plans and all of that in the future? I think they need to figure out a different strategy. I mean, unless they're willing to say goodbye to English culture, French culture, German culture, because I don't see any way around this. The numbers just aren't in their favor. I just don't see it.
Now, it's my understanding, and certainly lend some clarity here, is that these Muslim populations, especially in Europe, are demanding Sharia law. Is that true?
Yes, I think they are. And we don't see, we think, oh, well, Sharia law, it's going to be this, Ben Carson brought it up recently and got hammered over it, but he was exactly right. We look at Sharia law and think, oh, well, it's not going to happen full flower here, but it's happening little by little, just little things, just a little pressure. Like, for example, schools starting to teach Sharia law a little bit in elementary school, just with this idea that they're going to teach American kids about Sharia law, that little bit of creeping, or the little demands in places like Minnesota that they have halal foods in the food banks for everybody, but to accommodate Islam. So there's just little bits of creeping Sharia law already. And then, of course, the horrible cases we have of a few honor killings that have happened. I mean, that's Sharia law as well. So I don't think there is any way that any Muslim is going to give up Sharia law. I mean, and polls show that Muslims are supportive of Sharia law in a very high percentage.
Now, for our listeners who may not be familiar with what Sharia law is, tell us what that is exactly.
Well, it's Islamic law that is dictated by the Quran and through the various documents that support the Quran, the Hadith, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that people don't understand is that Islam is not simply a religion. It is a political system, and that's where the problem comes, that you cannot separate the two. And so when we have large numbers of Muslims entering the country, of course they're going to put their quote-unquote religion and their political system before ours.
Mm-hmm. And that's what really I feel alarmed about, is we live in a country where there's separation from church and state, but in this case here there's no separation, and quite frankly they're saying this is the way we want to live, unbound by your American doctrine, for instance. Right.
It's tough. I mean, I don't know what it is. I don't think there's any way to reach the people who don't agree. I mean, it's either you see it or you don't see it. You know what I'm saying? And we spend a lot of time hashing it around. But I don't see how. It's very hard to reach those people who simply do not see it.
Mm-hmm. So what can, how do we know it's happening in our neighborhoods, and what do we do?
Well, I'll tell you what. Most people never find out it's happening in their neighborhoods until it's well established. Even here in Hagerstown, they had already been bringing the refugees for a year before we even kind of knew it was happening. Technically, they are supposed to, when I say they, the State Department and the contractors are supposed to make a presentation and consult local government. Sometimes they do in the most cursory fashion, which is to make a little presentation and basically say the State Department says refugees are coming to your community, there's nothing you can do about it. So the local elected officials who've never heard of this program in the first place kind of just don't even know what questions to ask. So bottom line, the way people find out mostly is through happenstance. Like, for example, I'm going to write about northern Idaho when I get a chance later today. A woman noticed that there was a notice in a church bulletin that refugees might be coming to their town because the church was looking for helpers, volunteers to help with these new refugees. That's how people find out, sadly. There's no announcement ahead of time. So what citizens have to do is they have to, in my view, is you have to know your facts. You have to dig into the documents. You have to get your facts, and then you have to publicize your facts. And I think the facts speak for themselves, and that most people, once they know the facts, are aghast. I'm not saying they could stop it. There's a couple of places in the country where there's really a lot of hot action going on right now on this. One is Twin Falls, Idaho. Another is Spartanburg, South Carolina. Even the mayor of Athens, Georgia, for example, who's a Democrat, was able to actually stop the program temporarily because she said she wanted a plan from the federal government before any refugees came, and they are not forthcoming with a plan. So this is being done quietly, and that's how they get it done. And then once they have established a seed community, and Obama's task force on New Americans calls them seeds, seed community. The immigrants are seedlings to be planted in our soil of our communities. The soil is to change, according to Obama's task force, not the seedling. And once they're established, it's very hard to stop it.
Now, I guess I have to ask, President Barack Obama, you hear people claiming that he has political ties with the Muslim Brotherhood, and there's even the assumption, or the insinuation, if you will, that he may be encouraging this Hijra in America. What are your thoughts on that?
I definitely think that the Muslim Brotherhood is infiltrated, well, not even infiltrated, just been welcomed into the Obama administration, but it's way out of my area of expertise to know where and how and all of that. But Obama has promised to change America by changing the people, and that's what's going on. And he created a task force called the Task Force on New Americans, and their plan is to literally feed American towns with diversity, and this is all part of it. Now, whether he's specifically choosing Muslims, I can't say for sure. I want to emphasize to your listeners that the Bush administration brought in many, many Muslims through the Refugee Resettlement Program. It's been going on for 35 years, so it's happened through various administrations. It's not just Obama, but Obama has taken this to a new level. Right now, there's this big push on, your listeners may have heard about the Syrian refugee push to bring in the contractors that I keep talking about, meaning the U.S. bishops, Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service. They're all clamoring for 100,000 Syrian Muslims to be admitted into the United States in the next year. Obama so far says he will take 10,000. So they're very unhappy with him this morning because this announcement just was formalized yesterday. And when I say Syrian Muslims, my research shows that of the 1,700 who've been resettled so far, 95% of them are Sunni Muslims, and only a tiny fraction are Christians, Syrian Christians. So your listeners need to know that this effort to bring refugees from Syria to the United States is not an effort to bring the persecuted Christians.
This is also fascinating here. Do you have a website people can find out more about what we're talking about here today?
I do. My blog is called Refugee Resettlement Watch. It's just me here. I write almost every day, except if I'm traveling or something and can't. I've been writing for 8 years, and the issue is finally breaking on the national scene that I've just been sort of drilling away at for years. I have almost 7,000 posts that I've written on this subject, including information from Europe and all over the world on refugee resettlement. I have readers all over the world who come to my blog every day.
Now, as a result of your work, and certainly you've done quite a bit of work on this, and you're out talking to a lot of people about what's happening here, do you see your work gaining traction where we can feel encouraged by the fact that maybe this may not happen, hopefully, in the way that it's happened in Europe?
Well, there is a lot of traction. A lot of groups are now getting into this. Act for America, I don't know if you're familiar with Act for America. That's Brigitte Gabriel's group. They've come on board. They are now setting up a refugee resettlement working group in their organization. The Center for Security Policy, which published my little book, has now hired somebody to work on just this issue. The big immigration control groups like Numbers USA and FAIR are in on the action now. There's going to be a hearing tomorrow, the first time since 9/11, in the U.S. Senate on the refugee program. So things are booming. There's bills been introduced to put the program on hold until the finances are sorted out. I've seen so much action in the last 6 months, it's unbelievable. I don't think it has to do with me so much as the fact that the times are now catching up to this issue. In other words, this issue is breaking across the world. It's moved to front and center, and so therefore you're seeing a lot of action from a lot of different angles on this.
You know, and you see where the trouble is here, it seems, that as you bring people like this over, as you said, their religion and their politics are one and the same. You see the kind of civil wars that are going on over in the Middle East, between Islam and the Christians and so forth. And imagine that coming here, these people deciding, we're not going to follow your doctrine, we're going to follow our own, and then all of a sudden you have that civil war going on in the United States. And, there are people that talk about the fact that our government likes to somehow create an enemy so they can justify all the spending on the military budget. Is that something that we can see on the horizon here with this situation?
I can see it on the horizon. I personally think that this is the most important issue to face this country since our founding.
Right.
If we don't get immigration under control, the numbers and where they're coming from under control, we're finished. There's no way around this. It's just a demographic of war, essentially, and that's going to kill us. Demographics will kill us if we don't get this under control now. Right now, in the next few months and in the next year or two, if we don't get this under control, this is it. It's pretty clear.
Now, what's interesting about this is now we're watching the GOP debates, and Donald Trump, obviously the front runner there, is one who's been very loudly talking about immigration. Do you feel that, I guess, the way the media portrays what he's talking about is much different from what he really is intending, I guess, with his immigration points?
Yeah, I guess I can't speak for what Donald Trump is, what he's getting at or whatever, but I do know that he did follow his immigration plan was basically created from Senator Jeff Sessions' very bright staff and helpers, and Jeff Sessions has been the leading person in this country to fight for the American worker on the issue of if you keep pouring all these immigrants in here. And he's the one holding the hearing tomorrow in the Senate, by the way, in the afternoon, Judiciary Committee. People can watch it live, I'm told, from the Judiciary Committee, Senate Judiciary Committee tomorrow afternoon, too. But anyway, Sessions has been the leading spokesperson to say you can't keep pouring all these people in here and not expect our job situation. Our job situation is not going to get better by pouring more low-skilled, cheap labor in here. And that's, frankly, in my view, that's one of the main reasons driving those rhino Republicans, and I will say, call them rhinos, Republicans in name only. One of the things that's driving them on the issue to be silent on this issue is that they need these, or they're carrying the water for their big business supporters who want this cheap immigrant labor. So we're getting it from both ends. We get it from the Democrat end that want the new voters because immigrants vote Democratic, and we get it from the Republican end that want the big businesses that are funding these campaigns, or many of these campaigns except for Trump and except for Trump and maybe Ben Carson, are they're probably the only ones not getting a lot of big donors. I think Carson's just getting from little donors, and he spoke up very strongly about Sharia law and how it's not compatible with our Constitution the other day. The media is just carrying the water for the left, frankly, on the immigration issue. They just want to make it look like anybody who has concerns is a racist, a xenophobe, Islamophobe, and so on and so forth. And sadly, I think we spend too much time being worried about what they call us, because it doesn't matter what they call us. We're trying to save America here. Mm-hmm. Call us whatever they what they want to call us, but we keep doing what we have to do.
Well, it sounds exciting that we're actually opening up this whole thing, and that, as you were saying, it's gaining traction to where we aren't just going to allow this to continue, where they're bringing these people in, as you were talking about, for potentially cheap labor, but then we're the ones flipping the bill for this when there are plenty of people, obviously, in America who aren't working. You know, there are plenty of people here in America who are American citizens who certainly believe in the doctrine of the Constitution. You know, to allow people to come in and say, well, we're just not going to live in your country by your rules, yeah, you know, to me that seems to be a real problem there.
Yeah, well, you know, and any of your listeners who have just a modicum of common sense, which I'm sure many of them do, can see the insanity of this whole system. And right. One other aspect of it is that the refugees, you know, get these low-skilled, low-paying jobs in a meatpacking plant, which is one of the worst places that they have to work. And so you have to have some sympathy for the refugee. And then since the family can't live on that small amount of money that they get working in a meatpacking plant, then they can get all forms of welfare, which most people don't understand. The refugees, when they come in, they get welfare right away, which most categories of legal immigration are not permitted to tap into welfare, but refugees are. Mm-hmm. Therefore, it's one of the most desirable ways you can come into the United States as a refugee.
See, and that was one of the things that I first thought about. Okay, you're bringing this person in, as with any foreigner that comes into the United States, and it seems they automatically get these resources put into their lap, whereas a common American seems to have to go through this whole labyrinth of bureaucracy before they even get anything.
Well, right. As a matter of fact, these contractors and their subcontractors that operate in various cities, like, you know, you'll have a Catholic Charities in your town doing refugee work. Their primary job is to hold that refugee's hand and take them down to the welfare office and get them signed up for all forms of welfare, get their Medicaid, get the kids signed up for school, and get them in subsidized housing. So that they have like you know, a helper to help them. I mean, it's more than the average American would even have, who might have to sort of struggle to figure out which agency he goes to for this or that. These people have a person who takes them around to everything, gets all their paperwork done. And we pay the person to do that. In other words, we're paying the worker for Catholic Charities to do that. It really is insane. And most people, when they first hear about this program, they're just blown away. They cannot believe we have been doing this.
All right, so here we go. We bring somebody from the Middle East, for instance, as we've been talking about. We bring them here to America. Somebody grabs a hold of their hand, says, we're going to give you a place to live. We know you don't have any money, but that's okay. We'll take care of that. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get you a job. It ain't going to make you a lot of money, but don't worry, we're going to take you over to this office so we can supplement that income. And by the way, we're also going to give you health care insurance.
Yes, all
okay.
of it.
Yet a typical American, even with a fairly decent job, can't afford to get health insurance on average. Boy, this really makes a heck of a lot of sense, doesn't it?
Yes. And you know what? There's even more outrageous programs, but it's really getting into the weeds. There is one program run by these contractors in various cities. It's called a match savings account, where if the refugee puts aside a couple $1,000s into an account to purchase a car, the feds match him for a couple thousand. In other words, we put a couple thousand into his savings account for that car. It's really insane. And then you see poor African Americans. No wonder there's tension. There is tension in these neighborhoods because very often, and we saw it right here in Hagerstown, they put the refugees in the worst sections of town. That's the standard practice, into these cheap apartments in the worst sections of town, and then they wonder why there's tension between African Americans and the new refugee, some poor Christian from Burma or some poor quiet Bhutanese Hindu person from Bhutan is put in some African American neighborhood, and the African Americans see this refugee getting stuff.
Right.
I mean, you can see where the tension would grow.
Yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Oh, the insanity.
I know. Well, I know. The more you learn about it, the more insane it becomes. You could write a novel with it. Yeah.
Well, Ann, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to come on the program and talk to our listeners about this. And again, share some resources where listeners can actually go to find out more about this and how they can get involved.
Yes, well, they can go to my blog, and I keep up with the news every day. My job in this expanding young movement, as I see my job, is to report the news as I see it on this issue. Then if people are members of Act for America, they can join activities with Act for America. They can go to the Center for Security Policy and try to get hooked up with the groups working there, which is being run by a fellow named Jim Simpson, who is helping what we call the pockets of resistance. The federal government called us pockets of resistance. Anybody who's asking questions is a pocket of resistance, but there are pockets building. We're calling them the pockets building everywhere in America. So through Center for Security Policy, which is in D.C., you can get hooked up with a pocket of resistance perhaps where you live.
Very good. Ann, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. Give out that website where your blog is at, and I also understand that you have a book that's out about this as well.
Sure. My blog is just Refugee Resettlement Watch, and people just need to Google that because I've been around so long it will come up at the very top of their Google search, Refugee Resettlement Watch. I have a little book that Center for Security Policy published. It's a little slim book. It's called Refugee Resettlement and the Hijra to America, and it's basically how I got into this, what I've learned, and how I see this evolving over time. It's at Amazon, and it's a very short, simple, easy read. Jim Simpson has published another book after mine called The Red Greed Axis, The Agenda to Erase America. So people could look for that too. It's in this series that the Center for Security Policy has been putting out, little books on these topics.
There you go. And at very best, as an American citizen out there listening to this broadcast, maybe we can go and hold that hand and they can take us to where we can get free health care as well.
Yeah. Just try it sometime. Go into one of those refugee agencies and say, you need the health care too. Where do you go?
Yeah, I've only been in the neighborhood 25 years. Would that be okay with you?
Right,
and thanks again for joining us here on this program. You bet.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
You
Bye-bye.
bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Remember, get active, get involved. Otherwise, the neighborhood that's changing may be your own, and you may not like that change as well. You can also discover more by visiting us at Beyond50Radio.com. That is the number 50. Sign up for our free weekly e-news updates, and we'll keep you posted and in the know. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in, and remember, live your day past halfway.